Well, thank you for being here, and I want to say thank you to Dr. Magnuson and to the Commonweal Project and the guys that make that thing run. It's a joy to participate in this event. I want to come at this topic of work and what we were made to do from the perspective of biblical theology. And I would define biblical theology as the attempt to understand and embrace the interpretive perspective of the biblical authors. And so on this question of work, I'm asking three questions. First, what part did work play in the big story of the world through which the biblical authors interpreted their lives? So we all interpret our lives within the context of a story. What part did work play in the story from which the biblical authors interpreted their lives? Second, what propositional truths about work flow out of that big story and then back into it? And then third, do the biblical authors understand work to symbolize something beyond mere labor? So we will use these questions, or we will at least return to these questions as we think about what we were made to do and our labor in the Lord. The stories that we tell reveal our understanding of the world with our hopes and our fears, and the songs that we sing are poetic crystallizations of deep longings within our hearts. And we hope that the deep longings of our hearts are going to correspond to what we envision as the good life. And in our confused and distorted and fallen state, often our vision of the good life doesn't necessarily correspond with the story that we believe, and so we wind up doing things that don't comport with our story and having alternative visions of the good life. But at any rate, if we have a biblical understanding of the good life, in some ways this can comprise our vision of what the kingdom, the coming kingdom, is going to look like. And as a contrast, I would like to call to your mind a song, the lyrics from a song in the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" The soundtrack of that movie includes a song entitled "Big Rock Candy Mountain." And the lyrics of that song celebrate handouts that grow on trees and bushes or trees that sprout cigarettes and bulldogs that have rubber teeth so that their watchdog bites are harmless. In that song's idyllic landscape, you have streams of alcohol beside a lake of stew and whiskey too. Because those who sing this song want to escape reality by means of intoxication, and they want to be fed though they have not worked. They want mountains of rock candy. They want no tools such as shovels, axes, saws, or picks. They want to sleep all day, and they want to hang the jerk that invented work. I wonder if the songwriter realized that doing so would put a noose around God's neck. This song's sentiments fall significantly short of the glory that God intended when He created man in His own image and gave him work to do. Life at the Big Rock Candy Mountain would not result in true and lasting happiness or satisfaction. The Bible says there is a primal mountain that is our destination, but it's not one that will rot our teeth and indulge our character deficiencies. So contrast the Big Rock Candy Mountain with another song. And the song I have in mind here is Psalm 128. Psalm 128 is a song of ascents, and the text of it goes like this: "Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in His ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel." This song is addressed to a man who works, and the blessing comes to him because he fears Yahweh and walks in Yahweh's ways. The blessing of Yahweh takes the form of this man enjoying the results of his work, which he has done to provide for his wife and his children. In Psalm 128's depiction of the good life, you have hard work done to provide for others. This man's dependence, whose growth and fruitfulness are evidence of God's favor and blessing. In this psalm, prosperity includes godliness, responsibility, stewardship, and awareness of God, prompting fear and obedience and virtue. The man who is blessed in Psalm 128 is a God-fearing man. And in the context of the whole book of Psalms, the mention of Zion will evoke the Davidic king whom Yahweh set there in Psalm 2:6. The references to the prosperity of Jerusalem and to the children and the grandchildren in Psalm 128, 5 and 6 hint that what has resulted in this individual blessed man experiencing the joys of Psalm 128 has spread to the wider culture. Jerusalem prospers because its men fear God, obey his work, and work with their hands for the benefit of their wives and children. We could say that Psalm 128 is a poetic depiction of the blessings of the Mosaic covenant. So the Big Rock Candy Mountain and Psalm 128 sing different versions of the good life. In the Bible, the land of promise is not the place sought by freeloaders and slackers who long for an El Dorado where theft is easy, the hills are made of sugar, work is abolished, and handouts are freely distributed to tramps and bums who have neither responsibilities nor families. The Bible's songs are rooted in hopes seeded by the wider story, watered by God's promises. What is the role of work in that story? We begin our answer to that question by looking at what God created the good life to look like when the world was without sin. So we will start with work in the garden in Genesis 1 and 2, and if we have time, we might move out from there to the blessings of the covenant in Genesis 28, 1 through 14. The Bible story of the world begins with God doing work, 6 days of it. Once completed, not from weariness, but because the work was done, God rested on the seventh day. Given that man is made in God's image and likeness, with Christians in Ephesians 5:1 called to be imitators of God, the fact that the Bible opens with this scene of God doing the work of creation by his powerful word calls for our reflection. God works by speaking words. Among other things, this validates all kinds of knowledge work in which the hard work of thinking and communicating accomplishes what those made in God's image have set out to do. But what words are like God's words? What words could make worlds? In addition to being able to marshal his army of words to accomplish his purposes, we see from this vast and splendid universe that God is a skilled worker who completes his tasks with unparalleled excellence and creativity. Work is neither punishment nor cursed drudgery, but an exalted, God-like activity. Nor should we think that once God completed the work of creation, he was finished with work, as though he made the watch and then simply left it to tick away the seconds of eternity. As a justification for his right to heal on the Sabbath, Jesus declared, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." The Bible opens with a depiction of God at work, and the operational understanding throughout the Bible is that God continues to work, guiding, upholding, loving, judging, and saving. The first thing the Bible shows us about God is that he is a creative, competent, efficient, caring worker whose work provides for others, blesses others, meets the needs of others, and makes life possible for them. God didn't need to do this work. He did this work for others, for his creatures. Surely, This is meant to inform readers of Genesis as they confront the idea of man made male and female in the image and likeness of God. The creation of the man and woman is accompanied by a blessing and a task, a charge and commission, which spring from God's intention for man as he made them male and female. Genesis 1:26 presents God intending to grant dominion, royal rule over the animal kingdom. From the moment God decides to make man in his own image and likeness, God grants them dominion. Indeed, God grants dominion because he made them in his image and likeness. God made male and female in his own image, then he blessed them and told them what he wanted them to do. Man was created not for passive observation of the world, but for an epic task, a worldwide venture. Genesis 1:28 recounts, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God commands the man and woman in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply and thereby fill the earth, the whole thing. Then they are to subdue it, the whole thing. God next charges them to exercise dominion over the animal kingdom, the whole thing. The tasks in Genesis 1:28 are related to each other and interdependent upon one another. Man is to be fruitful and multiply so as to fill, subdue, and rule. It's interesting to observe that in order to subdue and rule, man will have to be fruitful and multiply. In order to subdue and rule, he will have to fill. This makes the fact that man was made male and female indispensable. The marriage of the man and the woman, that will be narrated in Genesis 2:18 through 25, will make possible the fruitful multiplication, which will enable the filling, subduing, and ruling. This tells us that the work God gave the man to do is not to be disconnected from marriage and family. In fact, marriage and family enable man to accomplish the work God gave him to do. These foundational realities in Genesis naturally give rise to songs like Psalm 128, where the blessed man enjoys the fruits of his labor in the context of his family. In the very good world that God created, Genesis 1:31, prior to the entrance of sin, Genesis 3:1-8, God gave man marriage to enable the completion of God-given and God-sized responsibilities. This is true in merely logistical terms. Without the woman, the man cannot be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And what the narrative draws our attention to, however, is the more significant relational blessing that God's gift of the woman was designed to be. God said that it was not good for the man to be alone, and he created a very good companion in the woman. This means that the fellowship and companionship and soul-deep oneness in the marriage of the man and the woman were given to make the filling, subduing, and ruling over the world a delightful adventure undertaken together. And I'm not going to go into this, but Bradford Wilcox has done really interesting research on why it is that married men make more money, exercise more initiative, and retire, in some cases, vastly more wealthy than do single men of the same class and same opportunities and so forth. Marriage is a tremendous blessing. In the true story Genesis tells, God gave marriage not only to enable the great task, but also to enrich the life and work that God gave to man. So again, the multiplying is for filling, and the filling is for the image of God to cover the dry lands as the waters cover the seas, so that all the earth will be subdued by those who image forth God's likeness. And thus all animals will be ruled by those who exercise godly dominion. the subduing of the earth seems to call for wild tangles of vegetation to be transformed into places where humans can live and cultivate gardens. The dominion over the animals suggests a stewardship of all living creatures so that all enjoy God's goodness. So let me summarize to this point. I haven't made this case, but I could make this case, and maybe you heard me do it or someone else do it in another context, or maybe you've read G.K. Beale, but I'm just going to take it for granted here, that God built a cosmic temple when he called creation into being. In that temple, he placed his own image and likeness. He then blessed his image and likeness and charged them with a responsibility. Their job was to make the world that God made good even better for both plant and animal life. Being in God's image and likeness, mankind was to cultivate the world of vegetation and living creatures in ways reflecting God's own character and creativity. Humans were made and put on earth as the visible representations of the character, authority, and rule of the invisible God. This means that the most fundamental answer to the question of why we are here is that we are here to reflect the character of God in the way that we subdue the earth and exercise dominion over the animal kingdom under the blessing of God. Doing these things in the image and likeness of God means that our task is to bring the nature and character of God to bear on all living things in the world that God made. So God gave stewardship to the man of the land and all life on it. Every task that humanity undertakes in God's world can be seen in relationship to those original commissions. Some jobs deal directly with plants and animals. Other jobs enable the stewardship of land and life. All jobs relate to these two great tasks. The making of roads and markets enables us to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over the animals. The tasks related to helping other humans flourish intellectually or spiritually enable people to deal with the land and living creatures. Arguably, every righteous task in the world, from that of the farmer or the rancher to that of the engineer, the software developer, or the nuclear physicist, from that of the ditch digger to the physician or the veterinarian, from the coach to the pastor, the zookeeper, the politician, the sergeant, the mailman, every task in the world can be seen in relationship to the subjection of the earth and the exercise of dominion over the animal kingdom. Not all jobs are righteous, of course. Sometimes wicked people hire others to commit sin. People are sometimes paid to commit murder or to bear false witness, to corrupt justice, or to commit adultery. Such jobs not only transgress God's commands, they image forth the character of the usurper rather than the likeness of the Creator. At its most basic level, a righteous job is one that does not exist to commit or promote sin, but to accomplish the tasks God gave to humanity at the beginning, to fill, to subdue, to rule. Such work affords everyone who does it the opportunity to image forth the likeness of the one living and true God. Genesis 1:26-28 tells us who we are as human beings and what God put us here to do. Who we are as bearers of the image and likeness of the Creator is inherent in what God has given us to do. The filling, subduing, and ruling was to be done for God's sake and in God's way to display God's own character. There is to be no disconnect, therefore, between what a man is and the way he does his work. How a man understands himself, his fundamental assumptions about the world, about God, and his own sense of purpose will be made manifest in the way he does his work. We get more insight into what God made man and woman to do in the Genesis 2 interpretive expansion on the Genesis 1 creation narrative. The connection between man and the working of the land can be seen in Genesis 2:5. Genesis 2:5 reads, "When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Here, Moses is not directly discussing man's role, but man's function is clear from the explanatory comment that God had not yet made man, so there was not yet a man to work the ground. This unexplored explanatory comment shows that Moses assumes that his audience will understand what he declares in the near context, Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 2:15, which is that man was made to exercise stewardship over God's world by working the land. The idea that man was made to work the ground is elaborated upon in Genesis 2:15. And I'm going to read you a literal translation of Genesis 2:15. And Yahweh God took the man and caused him to rest in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. This is the first instance of the term that I have rendered rest, the term nawak or nuak or something like that in the Bible. But the root will appear again in the naming of Noah, Noach, in Genesis 5:29, where Noah's father articulates the hope that Noah will be the seed of the woman who will roll back the curses on the land. And you can see this from comparing Genesis 3:17 through 19 and Genesis 5:29. Earlier in Genesis 2, a different term was used to describe the way that God rested, Shabbat, on the Sabbath day, on the seventh day. When God completed his work, he took a Sabbath, as it were. Our word Sabbath being derived from the verb used to describe God resting on the seventh day, Shabbat. When God put man in the garden to work, by contrast, he caused him to rest, and he used this verb, navak, there in the garden. So God caused him to rest in the garden to work it and keep it. John Piper once said on a panel discussion, "Productivity is restful to my soul." God caused Adam to rest in the garden that he might work it and keep it. Genesis 2:15 seems to point to a restorative rhythm of work and rest. We might even call it a restful work. It's also significant that God put the man in the garden to work it and keep it. This language of work and keep could also be rendered guard and serve. And these terms, work, keep, or guard and serve, are only found together elsewhere in the Pentateuch when they describe the duties of the Levites at the tabernacle, which they were to guard, where they were to minister. Once Moses' audience in the Pentateuch has gotten as far as Numbers, subsequent encounters of the use of that language in Genesis 2:15, in other words, when they come back and reread that text, as they would encounter this language, it would cast a priestly hue over the work that God put Adam in the garden to do. God charged the man with the tasks of filling, subduing, and ruling in Genesis 1:28, and this same task is restated as restfully working and keeping the garden in Genesis 2:15. So working the garden is an elaboration on the charge to subdue the earth, even as the tasks of filling and subduing the earth indicate that the man and the woman were to work together to make all the land that God made like the Garden of Eden. Keeping the garden would seem to overlap with the exercise of dominion over the fish, the birds, and the land animals. After all, fruits and flowers are delicate things that need to be protected from the unwieldy bulk of an elephant or the over-enthusiastic puppy. Given the fact that serpents and other animals will later be declared unclean, the man's work of keeping the garden may have included the task of keeping snakes out. The narrative of Genesis 2 proceeds to show God guiding the man through what it would look like for him to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over the animals. We also see what working and keeping the garden entails, as the man is to keep himself from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil on pain of death. Reinforcing the interconnectedness of marriage and family with work, the man cannot be fruitful and multiply by himself. God says that it is not good for the man to be alone. God then purposes to remedy what is not good by making a helper for the man. And just as the man was made to work and keep the garden, the woman was made, Genesis 2:18, to help the man. These roles are built into the nature of man and woman by the one who created humanity, male and female, as his own image. The man's role of working will entail providing. His role of keeping will entail protecting. And implicit in the narrative, we also see that the man is to lead, since he has heard the prohibition in Genesis 2:17, not to eat the fruit of the tree, though the woman has not heard this prohibition. This means that the man was to provide, protect, and lead. What does the woman's role of helping entail? Perhaps it would be easier to say what helping does not entail. For helping would seem to involve everything but what the man is to do. God created the woman so that together she and the man could be fruitful and multiply. God created her to help the man lead, protect, and provide. The jobs were given to the man to do, and the woman was given to help him do them. These roles are established so that together the man and the woman can accomplish the tasks set out in Genesis 1:28 and 2:15. They can only multiply together. They cannot do that without a total investment in the project from both of them. They can only fill the earth with their children, and they can only subdue the earth and have dominion over all those animals with the help of those children. Clearly, then, these children will need strong character and a diligent work ethic for these big jobs that lie before them. Our culture is in revolt against the idea that biology corresponds to sexual identity, to say nothing of the fact that some roles are given to men that are not given to women, and vice versa. The revolt seeks to overthrow the so-called gender binary, the view that humanity exists as male and female, as though being either biologically male or biologically female is somehow a too restrictive approach to the issue. Rather than viewing biological sex and the accompanying gender roles as some kind of straitjacket, however, we should receive what God made us as His gift and His purpose for us, and then marvel at the enormous freedom and flexibility within the broad indications of God's created purpose for the man to work and keep and for the woman to help. The specifics are not spelled out, leaving room for different personalities and relationships to maneuver freely as they dance to the music. The creational realities are like the ballroom, within which we find the dance floor, with the music and its beat provided as well. How each married couple dances to the music is up to them. But as creatures in God's world, they will dance in this ballroom, on this dance floor, to this music, with the man leading and the woman helping. Not to do so is to rebel against the created order. We can observe a theological analogy between the interpersonal relationships enjoyed by the members of the Trinity and the creation of male and female in the image of God. Within the Godhead, among the members of the Trinity, we find that the Father takes on certain roles, the Son takes other roles, and the Spirit does other things also. There's a diversity of persons and responsibilities within the Trinity, and God creates humanity in His image and likeness of two sexes, male and female, with differing responsibilities. As Richard Lentz writes of the plural, "let us make man," in Genesis 1:26, quote, "The immediate context at least signals a reflection of the Creator in human creatures, and that reflection must be considered relational in part." Men and women who reject the distinctions in roles given to male and female at creation rebel against God's purpose. He made man male and female to reflect His own image and likeness. We cannot reflect the character of God's unified diversity as the one God who ever exists as three persons if we reject the roles He gave to man and woman. the world ranged against God, has cultivated a sense that what is normal is for biological sex to be irrelevant to both gender identity and to the nature of the work someone does. In Genesis 1 and 2, by contrast, biological sex is directly tied to the roles given to man and woman. Our society is in rebellion against God's created order. This aspect of secular culture is at war with God's purpose for people as men and women. This culture also wants to normalize sexual rebellion, redefining marriage to include same-sex unions that by their very nature cannot be fruitful and multiply. The man, in Genesis 2:19 and 20, exercises dominion over the animals by naming them. And then the man names the woman. The man's exercise of his God-given authority over the woman, naming her, partakes of no oppression, no exploitation, and no lack of concern. It is noble, loving, biological, theological, true, righteous, pure, and poetic. God built this vast world, and then he created two people whose responsibility it was to be fruitful and multiply and fill this world, to subdue the earth and to exercise dominion over all the animals. Can you imagine a bigger task? Could there be a more daunting challenge, a more ambitious endeavor to undertake? What does God give to the man and the woman to accomplish these tasks? He gives them this opportunity to be in his image and likeness. And then he gives them his blessing. And then he gives them to each other in marriage. What Moses narrated in Genesis 2:22 and 23 prompts a statement in Genesis 2:24 that applies what has just taken place between Adam and the first woman, the first man and first woman, Adam and Eve, applies what just took place between them to all humanity. In Matthew 19:4 and 5, Jesus says that the Creator spoke the words of Genesis 2:24. This means that on the basis of what happens in Genesis 2:18 through 23, God says that men are to leave their parents and cleave to a wife, the two becoming one flesh. Note that to this point in Genesis 1 and 2, neither the man, Adam, nor the woman, who will be named Eve in Genesis 3, has a father or a mother. But God is speaking in Genesis 2:24 of a man leaving his father and mother. So this assumes that from what takes place in this scene forward, all men everywhere will have a father and a mother. In fact, it is impossible to have a male child or any child without a father and a mother. Those male children are to leave their parents, cleave to a wife, become one flesh with her, and then the new pair becomes father and mother. So before we leave this discussion of Genesis 1 and 2, let's return to these guiding questions in an attempt to bring together what we've observed to this point. What role does work play in the Bible's big story? By charging the man to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, having dominion over all other creatures, God was commanding his image bearers, the visible representation of the authority and character of the invisible God, to cover the dry lands with the glory of God as the waters cover the seas. This means that at the root level, man's task was to work in such a way that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, the name of the Lord is praised, the goodness of God is savored, and the character of God is known and enacted. Thus, the work that Adam made impossible by his sin is the work that Jesus has made possible through his death and resurrection and will accomplish when he returns. The earth will indeed be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. So there's work in the Bible's big story. The big task is to fill the world with God's glory. What propositional truths about work flow out of this story? And I would just observe that the way these narratives work and the way they're treated in the rest of the Bible is that the ethical principles and the truth claims are based on the story, not the other way around. In other words, you don't start with propositional truth claims that you then make up a story to buttress You have a story, and out of the story, the truth claims are drawn. So what propositional truths about work flow out of and back into that big story? The task being to multiply and fill the earth so as to subdue it and have dominion over the animals, marriage is foundational to the work that God gave man and woman to do on the earth. From the pre-fall, pre-curse narrative in Genesis 1 and 2, Paul derives normative, prescriptive gender roles determined by biological sex. Paul bases his argument that men and women are to be distinguished from one another, both in behavior and in apparel, on the reality that the woman was made from man and that the woman was created for the man. This means that so-called egalitarians have rejected the roles assigned to men and women by the Creator on the basis of biological sex. We can further say that same-sex marriage and transgenderism rebel against the created order by rejecting the normative nature of Genesis 1:27 and 2:24 articulated by Jesus in Matthew 19:4 and 5. Same-sex marriages cannot be fruitful and multiply, and transgender behavior rejects the sex assigned by the Creator. On the positive side, we can say that the narratives present the man's job in the context of his family. Adam was to work the garden and protect it. He was to lead his wife and the brood they begat, provide for her and the children through his work, and protect his wife and offspring as he guarded the garden. So in the same way that Adam works to benefit others, man is to work to benefit others. So I think this explains why it would be that men who have others for whom to work, they actually do more work and better work, and they're compensated in kind. Third question. Does work point beyond mere labor? Being in the image and likeness of God, working to fill the earth with God's image bearers, subduing it according to God's character, ruling it as God's representatives, work points to the character and glory of God. As man works, he is to make the ways of the invisible God visible to any and all who behold what he does. So this, I don't know what your job description is, but if you're a Christian, this ought to be part of it. In my work, I am to be making the character of the invisible God visible in what I do. Genesis 1 and 2 is the archetypal fountainhead of biblical symbolism. And it seems that the work spoken of in these chapters, working and keeping the garden, subduing the earth, and exercising dominion over the creatures, symbolizes all the work that man will do under heaven. We know what happens in Genesis 3. But can you imagine what life would be like had Adam not sinned? We can fertilize our imaginations on this point from the descriptions of the good life in the land that hint at what life and work were meant to be. These descriptions can be found, among other places, in texts like Psalm 128 and in the blessings of the covenant, where God promised what life would be if his people would obey his commands. So I'm thinking of texts like Leviticus 26, 1 through 13, and Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. And what we're going to do now is consider the blessings of the covenant in Deuteronomy 28 to get an idea of what life would have looked like. So why would the blessings of the covenant give insight into what unfallen life in Eden would have been like? Because though sin got Adam expelled from Eden, God did not alter his purpose from what he set out to achieve when he put Adam there in the first place. That purpose was and is to cover the dry lands with his glory. The promise made in Genesis 3:15 was passed down through the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, and then the blessing of Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3 elaborates on the promise. And that blessing of Abraham was passed to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to the sons of Joseph, and then eventually Judah receives this blessing in Genesis 49, 8 through 12. The wording of Genesis 5, 1 through 3 creates the impression that just as Seth was Adam's son in Adam's image and likeness, so also, in a sense, Adam was God's son in God's image and likeness. And that's an impression that's confirmed by Luke 3:38. Along these lines, when God declares that the nation of Israel is his firstborn son in Exodus 4:22 and 23, it is as though the nation of Israel is, in a sense, a new Adam. When God brings Israel into the land of promise, it's as though the new Adam enters the new Eden with a new opportunity to dwell in God's land under God's law, enjoying God's blessing. Just as Adam was to expand the borders of the garden to fill the world with God's glory, so Israel's king was offered the ends of the earth as his possession in Psalm 2, 8, and 9. In order for Israel to enjoy the land of promise, they had to keep the Mosaic covenant. And if they were to do this, they would realize God's purposes and experience God's blessing. It would be as close to Eden as someone could get on this side of Adam's sin. We're going to look mainly here at Deuteronomy 28, but there's one element of Leviticus 26 that particularly corresponds to the scene in the Garden of Eden, and that is the presence of God. The best thing about life in Eden was that God walked there with man in the cool of the day. The best thing about Israel's life in covenant with God was that God promised to make his dwelling among them, Leviticus 26, 11 through 13. Once that's stated in Leviticus, it is assumed all through the rest of what Moses says and doesn't need to be restated in Deuteronomy 28. But the enjoyment of God's presence was what would make even life in the desert seem like life in Eden. Eden, apart from God's presence, would be a hellish absence of the one thing that makes life sacred. Life in Eden without God would be no different from godless life in some lush place now, Breckenridge, Colorado, or Beverly Hills, California, or the south of France. Heaven without God is nothing but a pretty hell. Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14 opens and closes with statements that Israel will know the blessings this text promises if they obey Yahweh and do what he commands. The opening and closing statements, between the opening and closing statements, the blessings are detailed in Deuteronomy 28, 3 through 12. They're promised to the obedient. And what you have in Deuteronomy 28, 3 through 6 is a series of merisms. A merism is a figure of speech where contrasting extremes are used to communicate totality. So, for instance, if you say, I searched high and low, what you mean is I searched everywhere. Similarly, to be blessed in the city and in the field, Deuteronomy 28:3, is to be blessed in those places and all others. To have God's blessing on the fruit of the womb, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of the cattle, the fruit of the herds, and the young of the flock is to have God's blessing on all forms of life, people, animals, and lands, Deuteronomy 28:4. To be blessed in basket and kneading bowl is to be blessed in all forms of collection and preparation, Deuteronomy 28:5. And to be blessed coming in and going out, Deuteronomy 28:5, is to be blessed everywhere you go. These verses proclaim that obedience to God results in everything you do being blessed, all forms of life around you being blessed, and your every movement from one place to another being blessed. Is it any wonder that Psalm 1 is in the Bible? Blessed is the man, and so forth. Deuteronomy 28:7 declares that God will defeat the enemies of his people. 28:8 says that everything they store and anything they undertake will be blessed. And 28:9 announces that God will consecrate his obedient people to himself as holy. This will result, in Deuteronomy 28:10, in the nations seeing that God's people are called by his name, with the result that the nations fear them. And then Deuteronomy 28:11 is virtually a restatement of the promise to Abraham of land, seed, and blessing. Deuteronomy 28:11 says that God's obedient people will have abundant prosperity in the fruit of womb, their seed, livestock, blessing, and land. God will give them the rain in its season, bless the work of their hands, and cause them ever to be lending, never to be borrowing. Could there be any way for life to be any better? Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14 holds forth a vision of the good life, promising that if God's people will obey him, this life will be theirs. The life described in these blessings of the covenant holds out the possibility of pre-fall gladness in post-fall gloom. God drove Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, but he extends to those who walk with him and obey his word the opportunity to have an Eden-like experience, though they live outside the garden's gates. If sin results in death, how can God promise life? Because as Song of Songs 8:6 says, his love is stronger than death, and because he instituted sacrifices for atonement. In the Old Covenant context, the promise of life is contingent on obedience. The obedience of Israel included their obligation to realize the guilt of their sin and offer blood sacrifice to atone for it. The blood sacrifices that made life possible to those who believed under the Old Covenant were fulfilled in Christ's death on the cross, as the author of Hebrews demonstrates. In the Bible's grand narrative, we see that the blessings of the covenant extend the hope of God's blessing even to the work God's people do. A clear propositional truth that can be derived from the blessings of the covenant is that God's promised blessing is contingent upon obedience. And then, so that's our second question. First question, what's the place of this in the big story? Second, what kind of propositional truths can be derived? Third, work continues to point beyond itself, with the character of God being displayed in the way that God's people do their work. God put man in the garden to work, and God intended to bless that work. And I'm going to stop here, but if we were to continue, we would see the way that sin has and does always make our work harder, because the very things that God gave the man and the woman to do, those are the very things spoken to when God speaks judgment over sin. So, to conclude, let me just make a few comments derived from this story. First, we are to work as the image bearers of God, and our work is about making God's character known. Second, God has created man in his image, male and female, he created them. And our biological sex cannot be separated from the work that God has given us to do. Third, what we are, maybe this is just a restatement of the first, what we are cannot be separated from the way that we work. So there are lots of conversations about private life versus public character, this kind of thing. According to the Bible story, there's no divide between those things. And then fourth and finally, through Christ, we have this opportunity to pursue God's glory by working as to the Lord and not for men. And there's a lot more that could be said about work in the New Testament, but I'm not going to read you the whole book. So I'm happy to conclude here at this point and open it up for questions. We have a few minutes for questions. If you have things that you'd like to discuss, I would love to entertain those thoughts. Anything you'd like to pursue, follow up on, or discuss together? Yeah.
I'm in environmental ethics now, so let me ask you a question.
All right.
Doing, ruling, extending man's sovereignty, and so forth. What's the place for wilderness? Is there something to be said for preserving great regions of wilderness?
What's the place for wilderness? Yeah. So one thought that comes to mind as soon as you mention environmental ethics, there is this statement in Revelation. I don't know if my eyes are going to land on it, but as the judgments are falling in Revelation, the announcement is made that the time has come for the destruction of those who destroy the earth. And those who destroy the earth are clearly the wicked, who are not in submission to the God of the Bible. So one response to those who are very concerned about the environment is that they ought to be concerned about the Creator, and that the Creator views the refusal to worship Him and submit to Him as destroying the earth. It seems to me that the other question, is there a place for wilderness, is not directly answered beyond rule and subdue, and I think I'm inclined to say that would be something that is left up to the discretion of those who bear the image of God, and if they come to the position that this is a good thing for us to have a protected wilderness spot, they have the freedom to do that. But it seems to me that guiding principles are going to be brought in here, and the guiding principles that come to my mind are, one, God has created the world for us. He's given us stewardship over it, and so never should the environment be exalted over one for whom the world was made.
Or excluding man from wilderness. If you just broke it off and said no one can ever
Right.
that's not, but you make it as a life-enriching thing.
Amen. Very well put. Amen. So if you didn't hear, he said there would not be a reason to rope off a wilderness and say no man can ever enter this. But if it is to be roped off as a life-enriching thing, then it could be a positive use of the world for the one for whom God made the world. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so the comment is made that the idea of roping off the wilderness is because man is somehow tainting the world. I think that we would say that approach to the wilderness would be sourced in a different story of where the world came from and what it was made for. And so again, we see the connection between the story and the ethical, the imperative, the norm that is derived from the story. So if your story is the world is evolving and there isn't a guiding creator, well, then you might want some place where evolution can be uninterrupted by human interference or something to that effect. I saw Timothy first.
How would you relate this to a theology of the city? Would you, in some ways, see the city as a failure to fill the earth, or would you perhaps think that if Adam and Eve had not transgressed, had not fallen, would we see sidewalks and subways in cities today in an unfallen earth?
Yes, to some degree, this is speculation, but I do think the Bible speaks to it in that there does seem to be a kind of endorsement of the city in the fact that the new creation is a new Jerusalem. And I am not one who takes the view that God lets man ruin his project and then he sort of picks up some ruined, sinful, rebellious aspect of what man has done and reforms it in a good. So I would be of the view that if the new Jerusalem is a good thing, then a city is a good thing, and that the idea of commerce between people, of people benefiting one another through their efforts to come up with useful things for other people, this is all part of the project and a good outworking of God's purpose. Yeah. Wait, I saw Paul's hand a second ago. Okay, so the question is, drudge work or apparently drudge work that benefits society, but what was the? Yeah. Okay, it's not enriching to the people. So I would want to challenge your assumption that it's not enriching. And the way that I would go after it is I would say that from what we see here, God very much creates the work that man is to do to be inherently connected to and interrelated with the relationships that he has within the context of his family. So he's to be fruitful and multiply so that he can fill, subdue, and rule. And that means that in order for him to do that job, he's going to have lots of kids and then train those kids. And so I think that, and the Lord said, it's not good for the man to be alone, I'll make him a helper. So I think that that a man who has a rich and vibrant marriage can have a job that seems to some, maybe who don't have a rich and vibrant marriage, or who don't have children for whom they're providing, that could seem like drudgery. But a man who has these relationships and is working in the context of those relationships and enjoying the product of his toil in the context of relationships, even drudgery can be a joyful opportunity to interact with other people, to be consciously serving others. Now, I grant quickly, this is best case scenario, and we could probably go to the book of Ecclesiastes and say, okay, there will be moments when we will all look at what we do, even someone who has the most exciting job in the world or the most influential job in the world. You could probably survey those people and they would say, yeah, there are moments when there are tasks that I wish I didn't have to do. I've got other tasks that I prefer. I don't want to be doing this at this time, and so forth. And there, I think the admonition, the positive message of the book of Ecclesiastes is find a way to enjoy your work. And if you can, that's God's gift to you. So enjoy the fruits of your labor, eat, drink, and enjoy your labor, and enjoy your relationships. Ecclesiastes 9:9 even says, enjoy the wife of your youth. And if you can do that, it's God's gift to you. So, yeah. Were you next, Ryan?
I think so.
Okay, great.
So you talked about the interrelationship between family and work, and I was wanting to know if you could expand on how you see the role of singleness fitting in there and how that relates to the New Testament metaphor of the church being a family.
Sure. In part, you've sort of given me the answer to the question, haven't you? Yeah. So I would. What about singleness? I think that if we had not had the rebellion at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we probably would have had a scenario in which everyone was happily married. But Jesus says that there are different reasons that account for why someone might be single. Some, it's a gift given to them by God. Others, they choose that path for the kingdom. And then I can't remember the third circumstance offhand, but you know the passage I'm referring to. And yes, the context of the church does provide a family of sorts for single people. But still, I think the general assumption of the Bible and the sort of the expectation for what is normal is that a man will leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then the other things are exceptions to that normal expectation. Yeah.
When it relates to work that maybe not be so enriching, would you say that a healthy prayer life in combination with that work is a fantastic way to make that something that is productive for the glory of the Lord?
Well, of course. And ultimately, the healthy prayer life is just a function of walking with God. And if you're walking with God, drudgery is in the eye of the beholder. And often in a fallen world, what looks exciting is what the other guy's doing. And once we get into the other guy's head, we find that he thinks what we're doing is exciting. So when I was in seminary, I lived in the back house of this elderly woman who was very, very wealthy and lived in a very, very nice part of Dallas. And she didn't charge me any money. She was 90 years old. She wanted me to pick up the phone every day and call her and just check on her. And the guy that lived across the street from her, this is one of the nicest neighborhoods in Dallas, Texas. And the guy that lived across the street from her was a member at Park Cities Presbyterian Church, and he was an attorney in Dallas and was a young guy, early mid-30s, clearly making a ton of money to be living in that neighborhood. And we got to know each other a little bit, and he came over and looked at this little back house behind Mrs. Laird's house where I was living. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, and here I am, a single man. I've got nothing. I've got my car and a house, a little small apartment that I don't pay for, with a kitchenette, a microwave, and a toaster oven, a toilet and a shower, and that's it. And he looks at where I'm living, and he looks at me and he says, I envy you. And I said, what are you talking about? You're crazy. You got everything. You're married, you got kids, you got this great house, these great cars, this job that people would die to have. And he says, yeah, but you actually have to depend on God. And I said, well, you may not feel like it, but you do too. But still, it was sort of a profound statement that he would look at my life and say, you've got an exciting life because you don't know how you're going to make it next month. You actually have to trust the Lord to provide for you. So I think that, you might look at what some pastor at a megachurch does and think, man, he's made it. Where he's thinking, what a horrible setting I'm in. This is miserable. I wish I was back in seminary with the whole world before me and everything unknown. You just never know.